All right, chapter 4. I'm going to apologize in advance because my allergies have been acting up. It's that time of year, so if I sound a bit stuffed up, it's just because I am. What I'd like to talk about today is slavery. We're going to talk about the slave trade, the development of African American culture, and then talk about the rise of English liberty. And then we're not going to talk about the 7 Years' War because we're going to spend a lot of time in class talking about the 7 Years' War. That's an extraordinarily important event, and I want to make sure we have a lot of time for it. But so too is slavery. I mean, slavery, as we've talked about all the way up to this point, slavery is central to the development of the American colonies and the development of what we now know as the United States. So it's really important that we get a good understanding of what it was and the role it played in the development of the colonies. So let's start with the slave trade and where it came from. And there's the first part of your chapter, and of course you've already read the chapter. So the first part of the chapter talks about the Atlantic trade. And I want to step back a little bit to talk about the origins of the slave trade. It really started in the 1400s with the Portuguese. They had discovered by the late 1400s that sugar was this tremendously appealing and profitable crop. And the problem with sugar was that they just couldn't keep up with the demand. I mean, once people discovered what sugar could do to food, I mean, imagine life without sugar. I mean, what could all the things we love, we wouldn't be able to eat. And that's pretty much what life was like in Europe prior to the late 1400s. They just didn't have access to sugar. And once they did, the demand was insatiable. So the Portuguese, which were, Portugal was the top seafaring nation at the time, they were looking for sources, places to grow sugar. And they found them in the Eastern Atlantic, in the islands like the Canaries, because slavery doesn't grow in climates in Europe, in England or Spain or France. It's just not warm enough year round to grow sugar. So they found these places and they established slave-based sugar plantations in the Eastern Atlantic. And the problem with sugar is that it's tremendously labor intensive. So they needed this constant churn of laborers, and they had them because the Portuguese had been exploring the western coast of Africa for some time, and so they were the ones who established a slave trade between European nations and African nations, and this really flourishes in the 1600s as the New World is developed, and you have sugar plantations in the Caribbean that are growing tremendously, and so the slave trade starts to really take shape in the 1600s. This triangular shaped trade between the New World. You got North America, you got the Caribbean, you have Europe. On the other hand, and then you have Africa. There's the great map on page 139 that shows this triangular, this really treacherous slave trade, which flourishes in the 1600s, but really comes into its own in the 1700s. I mean, that's sort of the height of the transatlantic slave trade. And so what you get going from England to Africa, you get textiles, you get guns, you get iron bars, you have all kinds of manufactured goods that African empires are not producing. So they're sending that down there. Africa's sending gold and ivory and slaves to the New World, and then the Americas send back sugar and rum and later tobacco and all kinds of raw materials back to England. England's sending plenty of manufactured goods back to America as well, but that's kind of the triangular shape to the trade. And the trade extends from Cape Verde at the mouth of the Senegal River in northwestern Africa, really 3,000 miles down to the southeast into what's now Angola. I mean, this was a huge trade. And so what European traders would do is they'd establish relationships with African rulers on the coast, rulers of small African empires, and the Africans would then be responsible for going inland, and they'd go inland and they'd find slaves not among their own people but among other tribes and empires in the interior, and then they drag them back. They tie them up in these what were called coffles, basically where slaves are chained together, manacled together, and marched for hundreds, even sometimes 1,000 miles or more, to the coast of Africa, where they would then be sold to the European traders. And then once that, I mean, that was only the beginning of their journey, right? And then you had what was called the Middle Passage, right? Because the first part of the journey was to get from their homes to the coast, and then the Middle Passage was going to the New World, and then they had a third part, which was going to wherever it was that they were sold, usually in the Caribbean or in Brazil, but sometimes to the American mainland. And thousands and thousands and millions of people died on this Middle Passage, and you can see why. I mean, look at that image on page 141. This is a famous image of how slaves were packed in. Now, mind you, this image was not produced by an abolitionist. This wasn't produced by someone whose goal was to show the horrors of the slave trade. I mean, this was produced by an architect to show, okay, look, this is how you can fit. This is how you can maximize your production, right? This is how you can fit the most possible slaves into the hull of a ship. And it's extraordinary. I mean, just take a minute, right? Take a minute to look at the people there that are packed in like sardines. I mean, they're chained together. They're close together. Often didn't have room to turn over or stand upright. And it's not like they're just doing this for a couple hours. I mean, you can imagine how this would feel to just even spend 2 hours in conditions like this. This was a trip of many weeks over very rough seas. So you've got the rough seas. You're going up and down. You're going for weeks at a time. You're chained together with hundreds of other people that you don't know. You've got kids in there. There are no porta potties or anything like that. So you can imagine the unsanitary conditions of a slave ship. And it's extraordinary that more people didn't die. I mean, there are estimates that of the 20 million or so people that took the Middle Passage, maybe as many as 5 million of them died. I mean, these estimates are very rough, but just looking at slave manifests and comparing them in Africa compared to what the folks who arrived in Europe. Researchers have generated reams and reams of data and can make rough estimates, but as many as 5 million, maybe 6 million people died on that passage. And when they died, they were just heaved overboard. I mean, the slave traders had no interest in the dignity of the slaves. They were just trying to maximize profit. If somebody's sick or dying, off they went. They didn't want to have them infect the rest of their cargo, right? And so, this passage plays an extraordinary role in our history, right? I mean, the only people who could made it all the way across were the ones who were strong enough, who had the immunities, who for whatever reason were strong enough to be able to survive through the passage and made it. And even still, even with all the millions of people who died, millions more made it to America, to the Americas, and as we talked about before, more than three quarters of the immigrants from the Old World to the New World were African slaves. The vast majority of the people who made that trip were African slaves. We can't ever really forget that. And even though, and we see here on page 140, on your map on page 140, take a look at that map, and you see that the Portuguese Empire really got a lot of the slaves. The Dutch colonies, South America got a lot more slaves than North America did. In part, that's because of the simple fate of geography. I mean, that is much closer. It's much closer to the African coast than North America is. South America is much closer, and also that the earliest slave traders were Portuguese, and the Portuguese Empire was based primarily in Brazil and South America. But only 4% the slaves make it up to the British colonies. And yet, even with that small proportion of the international slave trade, look at the table. You see the table on page 147 of the slave population in North America on the eve of the American Revolution. I mean, it's incredible in the southern states. I mean, more than a third of the population in Virginia, more than 40%. The majority of South Carolinians are black slaves, right? And so by the American Revolution, 1 in 5 Americans, 1 in 5 people in this country are enslaved Africans. So it's always important to remember that the size and the scope of the slave trade. So when these people got here, we're going to focus on that 4%, right? We're studying American history. We're going to focus on that 4% who actually made it to America and who made it to the American colonies. And to look at how those people learn to survive and adapt in this very new and strange new world that they found themselves in. And Foner describes the rise of different slave cultures, and that what we call African American culture is really the blending of African traditions with European traditions in this whole new context, and to some extent the influence of Indians as well. But it's really this melding of these different traditions in a brand new context. Because one thing to remember is that African slaves are a very diverse lot. Just like Africa today is a very diverse continent. You know, we often tend to lump black people together. It's like, oh, black people, right? Everyone from the lightest skinned black person to the darkest skinned African immigrant, they're all black people. But that idea of a racial identity for all black people is really a 19th century concept. I mean, certainly there were differentiations. People called them Africans, but they also were much more attuned to differences in African culture. People at the time, slave owners, knew the difference between a Gambian and a Biafran and a Senegambian and the Yoruba tribe, and there are all these different tribes that people would come from, and so this makes it very difficult to develop an African American culture. I mean, you have people coming from different regions of Africa, speaking different languages, worshiping different religions, who had different histories, often conflicting histories, histories of conflict with different tribes. And they're all thrown together on this slave trip through this harrowing experience, then plopped together on different plantations. And a lot of times plantation owners deliberately bought slaves from different parts of Africa because they didn't want slaves to be able to coalesce. They didn't want slaves to be able to get along and get together very easily. But over the course of decades, that's exactly what happens. That people with these very different backgrounds in Africa come together on American farms and start to develop a new African American culture. And Foner talks about 3 separate African American cultures. And the first one I want to talk about is down in South Carolina, and to a lesser extent Georgia. Really the rice plantation culture of the lower South, because this is where African influence is at its strongest. Because rice plantations, as we talked before, they tend to be bigger. They require massive amounts of hard labor, and later on you get also, this is true in the sugar plantations of Louisiana later on, but the rice plantations of South Carolina, Georgia, you have large plantations with very large slave communities, and these communities tend to have very little contact with white people. They're off out in the fields. They follow what was called the task system, where the overseers and the planters gave slaves certain tasks to accomplish. Once they accomplished those tasks, they could be done with the day. And so there wasn't as much oversight on a daily basis as there was in the Chesapeake and elsewhere. And so what happens is slaves have more freedom to be themselves, to develop their own culture outside of white influence. And so it's here that African influence is the strongest. It's here that Africans develop what's called gullah, this kind of mixture language of English plus African dialects that is still spoken in some areas, especially off the coast of South Carolina, to this day. You get African traditions in music and religion that last much longer than elsewhere. So you have the slave culture of the lower South, South Carolina, Georgia. It's much more African, and then you have the slave culture that develops in the Chesapeake. Chesapeake tobacco plantations are big, but they're not as big as in the Carolinas. And you also have a lot of yeoman farmers who own slaves, but not a lot of slaves, right? So you don't have these huge communities of slaves, and you don't have the same kind of freedom. There's much more oversight of slaves by white overseers and planters, and so you see much more assimilation of the slaves into the European culture, and a much more intermingling of European and African traditions. The slaves learn English much more quickly. They're more likely to adopt Christianity as a religion. So there's much more European influence in the Chesapeake, and certainly in the middle and northern colonies. And he mentions that there's not really the development of a very strong, distinctive African American culture in the North because there just aren't that many black people. Black people are isolated. They're often the only if they are a slave, they're the only slave on a farm, or maybe their family's the only slave family in the area. And so it's very hard to develop a culture when you're on your own, when you're isolated. It's much easier when you're part of a larger community. That's why the African American traditions grow more strongly in the Chesapeake, but especially in the lower South, in South Carolina and Georgia. And then you have a third culture, which he talks very briefly about, that rises especially in the urban South, in Charleston and Savannah in particular, and that's what we're called mulattoes. Mulatto is not really a term we use that much nowadays. It's kind of like colored or Negro. It was a word that was used a lot in the past, but became associated with a lot of the negative parts of our history, and so nowadays we talk about mixed race people. As opposed to mulattoes. But it's a term that was very common at the time and didn't have a negative thing. In fact, the people who were mulattoes often embraced it. They even had gradations within mulattoes. They talked about quadroons, which were people who were had a one-fourth white ancestry, octoroons who had one-fourth African ancestry, octoroons had 1/8 African ancestry, and there were people who are very fixated on the lightness of their color, because these mulatto communities that developed often they mixed both the races, but also slave and free. A lot of the offspring, I mean, these were children of interracial relationships, right? Where, I mean, really often rape, where masters would rape their slave women and produce these children. But depending on the master, some of the masters cultivated their slave children, would educate them, sometimes sent them off to England to be educated. And so what you get is the beginnings of almost an upper class black culture, African American mulatto culture, that in some ways mimics the aristocracy of white culture in their taste in clothes, their mannerisms, the food they eat, the way they worship, the aristocratic, light-skinned mulatto culture of Savannah and Charleston. And you get this later on in Washington, D.C., New Orleans. You get this sort of in-between class, in between the darker-skinned slaves and field laborers of the plantations, and of course the white society. You get this very refined, aristocratic, almost mulatto African American culture. So those are the three cultures that Foner describes, and that's your second question. I realize I forgot to tell you the first question. So the first question deals with the slave trade for your homework. First question is about the slave trade, and that is to basically to describe how the Atlantic slave trade worked. Describe how involved colonial merchants were in the Atlantic trading system, and what was the role of slavery in that commerce. So that's the first question. And then the second question for your homework is to describe the three cultures, the three slave cultures that develop in North America. Now we're going to move on from slavery to freedom, right? Because that's one of the main themes, especially in the early part of this course, is how slavery and freedom develop together. It's almost like they're two sides of the same coin. You can't understand American freedom if you don't understand American slavery. And what happens through the course of the 1700s, through the course of the 18th century, is that liberty becomes this defining characteristic for British people, especially for British colonists in North America. It is what, in the minds of British subjects at least, it is what differentiates Britain and the British Empire from Spain and France and anyone else for that matter. And so this sense of liberty as part of the British identity is very important to understand. And this is happening at the same time that these same people are building slave boats and sending them off to Africa and selling slaves and marketing in slaves and selling slave products and I mean, they are completely intertwined in the slave trade, and they don't necessarily see the contradiction. The anti-slavery movement doesn't start to develop until the late 1700s. So these ideas of freedom that are becoming so important to English people at this time simply don't extend to the Africans in their midst, and just like as they don't extend really to the women generally, to the women in their midst. And so they're able to reconcile these ideas in ways that to our modern eyes seem like they can't go together, right? How can you profess liberty and still enslave black Africans? It just doesn't make sense. But to them, they saw no contradiction. And so I want to talk a little bit about the elements of English liberty, and Foner does a good job. I mean, this again is Foner's emphasis. He wants us to understand how ideas about freedom took root in the colonies, because these are gonna flourish later on, particularly in the 1760s and the 1770s after the 7 Years' War is over. And so you had different elements of English liberty, right? First of all, you had Protestantism. And we've talked about how central Protestantism is to English identity, in part because they see their rivals as being slaves to the Pope, right? Spain and France, Catholic, Catholicism was the religion of slaves, right? You were enslaved to the dictates of the Pope. You didn't have any kind of individual say about religion, any freedom of worship if you were a Catholic. And so Protestantism is a very big part of English liberty. And so too is the British Constitution. There's this idea that the British are different, right? We're different. We have a constitution. This makes us fundamentally different from everyone else, and it leads. Foner talks a little bit about it. It leads British people to look on others with contempt, right? Like, you're less than us. You don't have what we have. You don't have our religion. You don't have our constitution, and so again, the sort of irony of a nation embracing liberty as a central part of its identity, and yet rejecting everybody else who doesn't share it. But that's just one of the ironies that we study and we live with, and that becomes embedded in our own culture. And Foner talks about these two different ideas of liberty, which later on come to be seen as opposing or conflicting schools of thought, but they really aren't. In the 18th century mind, Republican liberty and liberalism are two parts of the same whole, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about Republican liberty, which really celebrates public life and the freedom to be part of the public sphere, to engage in the public sphere, to be active publicly. Of course, this is reserved for economically independent people, right? Freemen, people who own their own land, because the idea was that property owning people had virtue, and this idea of virtue. I mean, if you read writings by Jefferson and Franklin and George Washington, all these folks who were involved in the founding of America, you hear this concept of virtue all the time, and it's not so much, oh, I don't sleep around, and I don't get drunk. It's not the moral virtue, and that's part of it, but it's really this idea of political or public virtue, because the idea was that if you owned your own land, then you were kind of a masterless man, right? You weren't beholden to a lord or a master or the government, right? You were your own person, and that gave you the opportunity to think freely for yourself and to think in a disinterested manner. What does that mean? That means that if you own property, you have a stake in society. You're going to want society to flourish and succeed, and so you're going to make wise and prudent decisions about social matters, right? You're not going to be selfish and so forth, because your own interest in your land is going to depend on the interest of society. So you'll be able to make unselfish decisions about the social good. And that's what virtue meant, was the ability to step away from one's own circumstances and make unselfish decisions about the common good. And this strain of thought is very powerful. Historians call it republicanism, this idea of a republic. 18th century people didn't really embrace that term, but it was this idea becomes important and powerful in America because it warns about the concentration of political power. It warns that if too much power is concentrated in the hands of one entity, a church or a government or one branch of government, that's dangerous to individual liberty, and we have to be prepared to fight that. And this is linked to liberalism, right, which is the other major strain of thought. And this is identified with one particular person, John Locke. And again, if you read the notes of the Constitutional Convention, and you'll hear John Locke's name come up all the time in the deliberations, because he's profoundly influential to the development of American thought in the 18th century. And his idea, he has several important ideas. One is about the consent of the governed, right? He has this idea that government's not a family, which is the way a lot of people thought of family. It's a social contract, right? We buy into this social contract. We agree as individual human beings. We agree to give up certain parts of our liberty, right? We agree to give up our freedom in order to live in a society of laws, right? Because a society where everybody is free to do as he or she pleases is chaos. It's dangerous. It's the law of the jungle, as Thomas Hobbes said. It's nasty, brutish, and short, right? And in order to avoid living in complete freedom, we give up some of that freedom in order to live in a lawful society. And this is where we get the idea of consent of the governed, right? We give consent to our rulers and to our lawmakers to create laws that will constrain our freedom to some degree, but we consent to that so long as it doesn't get excessive or oppressive, right? And that the only legitimate political authorities are those political authorities that have the consent of the governed. So that's one element, the consent of the government. And Locke also talks about the role of government. Well, what is the proper role of government? Because he says that even though we choose to give up certain rights in order to join the social compact, we don't give them all up. There's certain natural rights that everyone has that cannot be ceded to a governing authority. Some of these are individual rights. They're about family, about religious worship. They're about private property in particular, right? That you can't take my property. You can't intervene in my family relations. You can't tell me how to worship. I consent to allow you to make laws that make society function, but there's certain natural rights that you can't trample on, right? So this emphasis on individual freedom and the consent of the governed, and the idea that the governed can rise up to overthrow the governing elite, the governing rulers, if the laws become excessive or unjust. This is the essence of liberal freedom, and you can hear echoes of this in the structure of our government today, right? I mean, we go back to John Locke and this understanding of liberal freedom. And again, liberalism and republicanism in the 18th century is very different from how we understand it today. And so you don't get too hung up on the word on those words, and don't let today's definitions color how you understand what they meant in the 18th century. But they're profoundly important, and they're going to influence generations of American thinkers. And so it's out of these two schools of thought, this Republican liberty, this liberalism, that we start to see the development of an American sense of freedom. These roots are going to grow through the 18th century, and especially after the 7 Years' War, they're going to flourish and take on whole new meaning. And we're going to talk more about the 7 Years' War in class. So now the third question. You had one question on the slave trade, question about American slavery. Now, the third question, I want you to explain the difference between Republican freedom and liberal freedom in the 18th century, and how those affect the thought in America. So, explain the difference between Republican freedom and liberal freedom, and how these ideas influence the development of ideas about freedom in colonial America. So those are the three questions. The fourth question is about images. This has some of the most powerful images that you're going to see. So I want you to, again, choose an image that you think is particularly powerful. Explain what it is, what it shows about the development of life in the colonies, and why you find it so compelling. Again, so fine. There's runaway slave advertisements. There are pictures of advertisements for slave auctions. There are all kinds of incredible images. There's Benjamin Franklin's famous "Join or Die" image that he creates at the beginning of the 7 Years' War. So choose one of those images. Explain what it is, what it shows about the development of life in the colonies, and why you find it so compelling.